Are the sounds of train horns haunting your dreams? Do you sometimes feel like you catch a little glimmer of chimney smoke out of the corner of your eye, only for it to disappear? Are you being haunted by the specter of railroading? Today, we're going to be talking about one of D&D's most overused and probably misunderstood terms, railroading. And if you're wondering, Stephanie, why is there a star on your face? It's because it is covering a zit made of spirits of pure evil. This star is our last line of defense, so let's hope it holds. But I swear, I feel like I see so many things where people will call anything where the DM has an idea or thought about where things might be headed with their party railroading, and it drives me crazy. Especially if you dare mention that your campaign might have a story. And that's wrong. So we're gonna clear this up right at the top. What counts as railroading? Have you ever been in a campaign where no matter what you did, the DM just kind of overrode your choices? Railroading is whenever a DM actively takes away player agency. So if the players want to try something different or take a different path, and the DM keeps dragging them back to the path or forcing a situation upon them, that's railroading. And this is something that can easily happen when people first start DMing. A lot of DMs have very, very cool ideas, and sometimes they get married to a particular one, or sometimes they're just not sure how to handle the players choosing something drastically different than they expected, and it gets difficult for them to pivot to match what the players would like to do. And I've definitely been in games where, as a low-level player character, I've tried to avoid combat, but no matter what I did or how successfully I did it, the GM would eventually make up something silly, like even though I got an 18 on my stealth roll to retreat deeper back into the woods to report my findings to the party back at our home base, the orcs could somehow smell the sweet scent of gnome flesh and knew that I was there from a mile away. And something like this once in a while can just be a bad call, and it's okay. Everybody makes them sometimes, it's fine. But when it turns into a pattern, it can make the players feel like they don't have any meaningful choices to make, and that's when it kind of becomes a problem. But please note, not one bit of this has anything to do with linear stories. Any of these things can happen just as easily in a sandbox campaign. And the real issue here boils down to a clash of expectations. It's a power struggle between players craving freedom and a GM that's too attached to their own plans. In fact, I'd be willing to wager that a lot of these issues have a lot more to do with differing playstyles or an issue in how the game was set up and presented to players, probably more than anything else. Because again, having a linear story in your TTRPG and railroading are not the same. And before we dive into this distinction, if you're enjoying this video and would like to see my star-stickered face pop up in your feed again, make sure to like and subscribe so the tubes that be can know and send you my face in the future. So now let's talk about all of the things that people say are railroading, but simply are not. Planning ahead? Not railroading. It's fine for a DM to think about story paths or potential outcomes. In fact, I'd argue that it's part of the gig. Planning ahead can be super helpful, granted that you're not so married to one of your ideas that you end up railroading your players. But one of the things I really love to do is what I call shower planning. Naturally, you don't have to do this in the shower, but if you've got one of those nice TikTok, waterproof lamp, plant, little speaker setups, it can help. So what I'm doing when I do this is essentially playing a what-if game. And I'm just thinking about all the things my party might try to do, where they might be headed, or ways that they might react if something happens. It's super low-key, but it helps me really get in like the mind of my world and kind of see the possibilities of the many different directions this story can head in. And this video is not sponsored by Cocoon Weaver, but it should be. You can't take a notebook into the shower, but you can yell at your phone to record a voice note, which is exactly what I do. Structure is not railroading. Let me ask you something. Do you like stories? Good stories? Ones with climaxes and twists and cool payoffs? Of course you do. structure isn't the enemy. It's the thing that makes those things possible. A game with story beats, like climactic boss battles, isn't railroading. Pacing and payoffs are important. So think about your favorite movies, TV shows, books, video games. You ever notice how exactly none of them have characters just wandering around waiting for something cool to happen? A mystery. It's an idea that can seem cool and translatable from open world video games, but it's not. Even the most open world of video games guide you, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, towards the action. So why should TTRPGs be any different? And seriously, if you want to learn some really cool things about game designers who design all of these open worlds, go check out some videos about them talking through all of the tricks they use to kind of create this illusion. Not all of them are applicable to TTRPGs, but a lot of them are. And if you want to specifically understand how to incorporate story beats into your games while still having them be player-driven, Robin Law's book Hamlet's Hit Points is a really great read, so check it out. But the most important thing of all, linear stories are not railroading. Seriously, I feel like I get like all twitchy when people suggest this, but a good linear story doesn't mean that the DM is controlling everything. The joy of TTRPGs comes from player-driven action in these stories. And guess what? That's totally possible with linear stories. And I'll show you how to make that happen in just a bit. But it's okay for a campaign to have things like direction and story arcs, just as long as the players have meaningful choices that have real impact on the story that they're playing within. And so here's why this matters. So many DMs, but especially new DMs, are so afraid of committing the cardinal sin of railroading that they end up missing out on the feeling of getting to be an actual player in their campaign. Instead, it can relegate DMs to being the nice lunch lady that watches the kids play Red Rover at recess, rather than another kid playing Red Rover out at recess. And not to brag, but I dominate at Red Rover. So here's the thing about sandboxes versus linear storytelling. This isn't some cosmic battle between good and evil. It's just preferences. But if we admitted that, we wouldn't get to scream at strangers on the internet. And who am I to take that joy from people? But seriously, it's totally okay if you like to be part of a pack of players roaming around, capital D, capital S, doing stuff. It's equally okay to prefer to be part of a story. They're both valid playstyles and neither is inherently better. And to me, the vibe that sandbox games have always kind of given off is it's kind of like playing The Sims, where you're kind of messing around doing one thing over here, and then if you get bored, you can just go mess around and do this other thing over there. While linear games kind of feel more like Zelda, the Ocarina of Time, where sure, you can like mess around for a little bit, but there is a satisfying story arc that you are participating in. Even though they're very different types of games, they're both a blast. And even more importantly, I don't actually think there's a huge distinction between sandbox and linear games at all. In my experience, interesting sandbox games often morph into more linear ones over time anyways, because the GMs are putting out interesting plot hooks for the characters to pick up on, and then the players are pursuing the ones they're most into. So in that situation, what's the meaningful difference between doing that, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, and just doing that from the beginning and deciding as a group what would be the most fun sort of story to play through? In my opinion, there isn't much of one. I honestly think this whole divide is kind of one of those fake internet manufactured debates, because a lot of times the terms we use to describe TTRPGs aren't really these rigid categories, but they're more like spectrums than anything. And that's a whole video for a whole nother time, but that's just how I tend to think about them. And I truly believe that spectrum style thinking can make anyone's games better. Because like I said, good sandboxes often involve more linear moments and more structured story elements. And good linear games often incorporate more sandbox-inspired elements. It really doesn't have to be one thing or the other. And all that really matters at the end is that you and your table love the game you're playing, whether it upsets the internet or not. Okay, so now for the juicy part. How do we as GMs avoid railroading our players while still creating a story that's engaging and fun to play through? You become magicians, my friends. You create the illusion of a linear story. And we're gonna refer to this as tying your story together. Get it, guys? Like railway ties? So yeah, we're continuing with train wordplay. Today is the day you finally conquer your sideromophobia, my friends. So what I want you to imagine is that you're this little cartoon character and all of your friends are on this big train and it's about to run out of tracks. So what you need to do is lay down a railway tie right before they get to it. But, you know, with like D&D stories and prep and stuff. Yeah, so what do I actually mean by this? When your players arrived at the train station, and by that I mean when you guys had your session 0, together you decided what would be a cool journey to take and what potential destination you wanted to head off to. And if you're not familiar with a more collaborative approach to session 0s, make sure to check out my video in the link below about doing that. But the idea is that your players wanted to take this journey and prepped accordingly. They built characters that would in fact take this thing out for a spin. The thing is, there's only those first few tracks down, your initial onboarding that helps players get into this world. After that, we only have way stations and a possible destination out there. And more on that in a second because you might not actually reach the destination you thought you were going to. But the important thing is that we're missing a ton of tracks. This is where your players come in. Because again, you do want your player actions and choices to be the thing that's really driving your story. You're responding to them as the world and parsing out what you would think happens because of their actions. You're just not doing meaningful planning far out in advance. That's where all the ideas live, and ideas can be fleeting. Right now, you are simply laying down tracks one at a time, one session at a time, until you reach a way station. These are your ideas for bigger moments, like a big event or a big boss battle that potentially could happen. And luckily for us, this cartoon desert is chock full of way stations. So we can just reroute and go to the appropriate way station as needed. And this means staying flexible and not forcing things upon players. So you can adapt if there's something they're obviously trying to avoid or if their actions impacted the story in a bigger, unexpected way. And as we find the right way stations that fit our groups, we also want to keep our destination in mind. Because again, cartoon trains are wild and tricksy. And even though we set off with a certain endpoint in mind, it's also okay if the series of events that happen throughout the story end up being so big that you actually end up with an entirely different ending than you were expecting. Again, that's the fun of TTRPGs. The point is, there's always some satisfying point you can end up with your group. And it's really important that you trust your ability to adapt and know that you will get your group to that satisfying end. Ultimately, all you're doing is laying down these tracks to connect the dots between way stations and finally your destination. So when you do your prep, spend time thinking about the different plot hooks you can throw out that will take your PCs closer to each of these way stations. And each way station can just be the one that makes the most sense for the story you guys have created along the way. And what this style of thinking usually leads to is this more hybrid approach between linear and sandbox style campaigns. Because new goals will appear as the players discover them, and they get to make meaningful story-impacting choices as they go. But you're still not just fumbling around in the dark for something that sounds cool. And as the GM, all you really need to do once the train starts chugging along is react to the choices that your players make and help weave the results into a cohesive story. Again, at the end of the day, all that matters is that you and your players are having fun. Plans aren't trains and ideas aren't prisons. Scrap your concerns about weird internet discourse. If your group loves your game, y'all are doing it right. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out these ones next.